Chapter 1. The vanishing the canal smelled of wet earth and decay, their dark waters moving under the faint moonlight. Luis crouched near the edge, his fingers digging into the damp ground as he sifted through debris strewn along the bank. His hands, caked with mud, pulled a dented soda can from the muck. He examined the can in the pale light, turning it over carefully before dropping it into the sack slung over his shoulder. Scavenging wasn't glamorous, but it kept him fed. Cans, bottles, anything redeemable for cash, were worth the effort. The canals, isolated and quiet, were his preferred hunting ground. Unlike the crowded camp, here he didn't have to compete with others. Most stayed away, haunted by stories whispered around the fires. Luis wasn't afraid of ghost stories. At least, not until now. A soft slither broke the stillness. Luis froze, his fingers hovering over a half-buried beer bottle. The sound came again, a wet, dragging noise, faint but deliberate. Slowly, he turned his head toward the canal bank, scanning the shadows. Piles of mud and debris dotted the area, blending into the darkness. At first, he saw nothing, but then something moved. A dark, glistening shape detached itself from the mud. It slithered forward, its body rippling with an unnatural grace. Luis staggered back, his sack of cans dropping to the ground with a muffled thud. His breath hitched as more shapes emerged, sleek and slimy, their tendrils dragging through the mud with wet slaps. One of them paused, its eye stalks rising. Luis's heart hammered as he realized what he was looking at. The stalks weren't ordinary. They were tipped with eyes. Human eyes. They were large and glassy, unblinking and wet, reflecting the moonlight like small mirrors. The irises seemed to shimmer, following his every movement with a cold, detached focus. The way they moved wasn't random. The eyes swiveled independently, one tilting toward his face, the other scanning his trembling hands. Luis tried to tell himself it wasn't real. He wanted to believe it was a trick of the light or a cruel hallucination brought on by hunger. But the eyes didn't blink, and they didn't waver. They saw him, really saw him, when the largest of the creatures darted toward him, its tentacles unfurling with a wet hiss. Luis screamed. The sound tore through the night, sharp and desperate, but it was cut off too soon. The other shapes surged forward, their slimy bodies writhing and coiling as they closed in. The human-like eyes on their stalks never looked away, locking onto him with a hunger that felt worse than anything Luis had ever known. By the time the moonlight returned to Canal Bank, the sack of cans was all that remained. A faint trail of slime glinted in the darkness, winding away toward the water. Chapter 2. The bell above the door jingled faintly as Gregory Parker looked up from his ledger. A man he barely knew stepped inside, his boots leaving faint smudges of mud on the clean floor. Miguel Delgado hesitated near the doorway, his tool bag slung over his shoulder, eyes darting around the store. "Evening," Gregory said, his voice calm but curious. "Something I can help you with?" Miguel nodded slowly, stepping closer to the counter. "Just some water, maybe a snack." Gregory watched him carefully, noting the tension in the man's posture. "Long day." Miguel gave a faint smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "You could say that. Been working on the canals. It's a mess out there." Gregory handed him a bottle of water. "Canals, huh? You new to the area?" Miguel nodded. "Started a few weeks back. Maintenance contractor. My boss sent me out late last night to check a blockage. Let's just say I saw some things that didn't sit right." Gregory frowned, leaning forward. "What kind of things?" Miguel hesitated, glancing at the door as if considering whether to leave. Instead, he opened his tool bag and pulled out a small plastic container. Inside was a mass of slimy, translucent flesh that shimmered faintly under the fluorescent lights. "What in God's name is that?" Gregory asked, recoiling slightly. Miguel placed the container on the counter. "I found it stuck in a grate. And that's not the worst of it. There were trails, slime trails, and the grate itself was bent like something huge forced its way through." Before Gregory could respond, the bell jingled again. Dean Parker stepped inside, his uniform crisp but his expression sharp. His eyes immediately landed on Miguel. "Who's this?" Dean asked, closing the door behind him. Gregory gestured toward Miguel. "This is Miguel Delgado. Works on the canals. Says he's seen some things you might want to know about." Dean frowned, stepping closer. "What kind of things?" Miguel sighed, crossing his arms. "Slimy things. Big enough to tear through steel grates. I found this out there last night." He pointed to the container on the counter. Dean's eyes narrowed as he leaned in to examine it. "Where exactly did you find this?" "Near the eastern stretch, close to the irrigation junction," Miguel replied. "It's not just a slime. Something's out there. I saw it moving, and I swear it was watching me." Dean straightened, his face darkening. "We've had reports of people disappearing near those canals. Homeless folks, mostly. You're saying this could be connected?" Miguel nodded. "I don't know what else it could be. Whatever's out there, it's not just sitting around. It's spreading." Gregory folded his arms, his gaze shifting between the two men. "You've been looking into this already, Dean?" Dean nodded grimly. "Yeah, it's my jurisdiction, but without solid evidence, it's hard to act. This," he gestured to the container, "this changes things." Miguel glanced at the door. "Look, I don't want trouble. I just figured someone should know. My boss doesn't care what's out there as long as I get the canals running. But if you're going out there—" He hesitated. "Be careful. These things aren't normal." Dean nodded. "You're not going back alone. If you ever head out there again, call me first." Miguel met his gaze, then gave a reluctant nod. "All right, just don't underestimate them. They're faster than they look." As Miguel left, the bell jingled faintly behind him. Gregory turned to Dean, his expression uneasy. "What are you going to do?" Dean picked up the container, his jaw tightening. "Figure out what the hell we're dealing with, and fast." Chapter 3. The trail of the air near the canal was thick with the stench of decay, mingling with the faint gurgle of water as it trickled through the muddy banks. Dean Parker adjusted his flashlight, the beam slicing through the darkness. The slime trail glistened in its light, snaking through the mud like some grotesque road map. He crouched low, examining the thick, sticky substance clinging to the ground. It shimmered faintly, catching the light in an almost iridescent sheen. "What do you make of it?" Dean asked without looking up. Miguel Delgado stood a few feet away, his arms crossed tightly over his chest. "Same as what I found last night. It's everywhere. Trails leading in and out of the water, like they're moving between the canals and the banks." Dean straightened, his expression grim. "And you're sure this wasn't runoff or some kind of industrial spill?" Miguel gave a short laugh, devoid of humor. "Runoff doesn't bend steel grates in half, and it sure as hell doesn't leave behind." He trailed off, gesturing toward the faint outline of something large and glistening ahead. Dean turned his flashlight toward the bank. His jaw tightened as the beam caught movement, quick, fluid, and unmistakably alive. "Stay back," Dean muttered, motioning for Miguel to keep his distance. The creature slithered into view, its slick, undulating body glinting in the faint light. Eye stalks rose from its head, swaying as they tilted toward the men. At their tips were large, glassy eyes, unnervingly human in appearance. "Jesus Christ," Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible. The creature's movements were deliberate, calculated. Its tentacles unfurled from beneath its body, ridged and glistening with a faint sheen of slime. Dean caught a faint hissing sound as droplets fell from the tentacles onto the mud, steaming as they dissolved the earth beneath them. "What the hell is that?" Miguel muttered. Dean didn't answer. His pulse quickened as the creature hissed, a wet, bubbling sound that echoed unnaturally in the still night air. Without warning, the creature lunged, its tentacles whipping toward Dean. He raised his arm instinctively, and one of the appendages lashed across it. Pain shot through him as his sleeve smoked, the corrosive poison eating into his skin. Dean fired his weapon, the sharp cracks breaking the silence. The bullet struck the creature, causing it to recoil momentarily, but it wasn't enough to stop it. Another tentacle lashed out, grazing his side before he stumbled back. "Run!" Dean shouted, his voice raw with urgency. He grabbed Miguel by the arm, yanking him toward the embankment. The two scrambled up the embankment, their boots slipping in the mud. Behind them, the wet slaps of the creature's tentacles grew louder, their hisses echoing through the darkness. Miguel reached the truck first, throwing open the door and climbing in. Dean stumbled in after him, slamming the door shut just as one of the creatures lashed against the side of the vehicle. The truck shuddered, the metal where the tentacle struck hissing and bubbling as the corrosive slime ate into it. Miguel fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling. Come on," he muttered, finally getting the engine to roar to life. The truck lurched forward, its tires kicking up mud as it sped away from the canal. "Did you see that?" Miguel gasped, his voice shaking. Dean clutched his injured arm, his teeth gritted against the pain. "Yeah," he muttered, "and we're not going back." Miguel opened his mouth to reply but stopped, his eyes widening as the headlights swept across the canal bank one last time. There, partially hidden by a mound of debris, was a smaller creature, its tentacles wrapped around the body of a rat, holding it in place as a hidden proboscis extended from its body. Miguel's stomach turned as the proboscis injected a clear, viscous fluid into the rat, dissolving the flesh. The liquefied remains pooled beneath the creature, which then siphoned them up with unnerving efficiency. "It's feeding," Miguel whispered, his voice barely audible. Dean didn't respond. His knuckles whitened against the dashboard as the truck rumbled down the road. The image of the feeding creature burned into his mind. Chapter 4. Improvised Arsenal Miguel Delgado paced nervously in the back of Gregory Parker's store, his hands brushing over the shelves cluttered with old tools, rusting cans of paint, and forgotten hardware. Dean leaned against a table nearby, cradling his injured arm, the pain from the creature's corrosive tentacles still fresh in his mind. "We're not going to survive another attack like that," Dean said, his voice clipped. "Bullets barely slow them down, and I'm not looking to get eaten." Miguel stopped abruptly, snapping his fingers. "Wait, what about ammonium nitrate?" Dean frowned. "Fertilizer?" "Yeah, but not just any fertilizer," Miguel said, digging through a shelf until he pulled out a weather bag with a faded label. "It's reactive when exposed to heat. Farmers use it to treat soil, but if we load it into shotgun shells..." Dean straightened, his expression darkening. "You think it'll work?" Miguel shrugged, already tearing open the bag. "It'll burn like hell when fired. That might be enough to weaken them, or at least drive them off." As Miguel began packing the shells, Gregory frowned, his eyes narrowing. "What's that smell?" Dean's head snapped up, his hand instinctively reaching for his shotgun. A faint, wet slapping noise echoed from the alley outside. "Please tell me that's just a busted pipe," Miguel muttered, though the dread in his voice betrayed his lack of conviction. Gregory moved to the window, pulling the curtain aside. His face went pale. "It's one of them." Dean cursed under his breath, loading one of the modified shells into his shotgun. "How the hell did it find us here?" Miguel's stomach dropped. "It must have hitched a ride on my truck when we left the canal." His voice trailed off, guilt and fear mingling on his face. The three of them stepped cautiously outside, Dean taking point with the shotgun raised. Miguel stayed close behind, gripping a crowbar, while Gregory carried a flashlight that shook faintly in his hands. The creature slithered into the open, its eye stalks swiveling toward them with predatory focus. Its slick body glistened under the faint glow of the store's exterior light, and its tentacles writhed in anticipation. Dean didn't wait. He aimed directly at the creature's center mass and pulled the trigger. The shotgun roared, and the ammonium nitrate ignited in a fiery explosion. The creature screeched, flames engulfing its slimy body as it thrashed violently. The slime boiled away, leaving blackened, smoking patches across its flesh. "It's working," Miguel shouted. The creature tried to lunge forward, its tentacles flailing, but its movements grew weaker. Finally, it collapsed into a smoldering heap, the acrid stench of burned flesh and scorched slime filling the air. Dean lowered the shotgun, his face set in grim satisfaction. "Looks like fire's our best shot." Miguel nodded, a flicker of hope breaking through his fear. "We'll need more shells. A lot more." Gregory grimaced, staring at the charred remains. "You sure you didn't just piss them off?" Dean's jaw tightened. "If we did, we'll be ready." Back inside, the atmosphere grew grim as the trio prepared more shells. Miguel worked quickly, packing the casings while Dean and Gregory scavenged for anything else that could serve as a weapon. Old pipes, crowbars, and makeshift torches piled onto the table. "We're not just dealing with dumb animals," Dean said, his tone serious. "These things are smart. They're hunting us, and they know how to work together. That's why we need to hit them hard and fast," Miguel added, sealing another shell. "No hesitation." Gregory placed a hand on Dean's shoulder. "You're sure about this? Going back out there?" Dean nodded, his gaze steady. "We don't have a choice. If we don't stop them now, they'll overrun the whole damn town." Chapter 5. Into the unknown the night was still, but the air carried a tension that settled deep into Dean's bones. He tightened the strap of his makeshift pack, now loaded with ammonium nitrate shells and a few Molotov cocktails Miguel had cobbled together. They stood by the edge of the canal road, the dim moonlight casting eerie reflections on the dark water. Beside him, Miguel fidgeted, his eyes darting toward the wagon loaded with supplies. Gregory gave the little red flyer a firm push, ensuring the cardboard box of Molotovs was steady. The sight of the childhood wagon in this grim setting sent a pang through Dean, but he shoved the feeling aside. "We've got fire," Dean said, adjusting his grip on the shotgun. "But if we're going to end this for good, we'll need more than that." Miguel raised a hand, pointing down the road. "There's an old construction site near the East Canal Junction. They left some equipment behind when the project got scrapped. Maybe we'll find something we can use." Gregory looked skeptical. "And what exactly do you think you're going to find out there?" "Explosives," Miguel said simply. "If we can get charges, we can collapse the whole tunnel." Gregory shook his head. "You're crazy. That place has been abandoned for years. You really think they left charges lying around?" Dean smirked faintly. "Only one way to find out." The drive to the site was quiet, the truck rumbling over uneven roads. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating rusting machinery and skeletal scaffolding that loomed like ghosts in the night. Miguel jumped out first, scanning the area. "If they left charges, they'll be in the storage containers." He pointed to a cluster of faded orange boxes tucked near a pile of forgotten concrete slabs. Dean followed, his flashlight sweeping the ground as they approached. Miguel pried open the first container with a crowbar, coughing as a cloud of dust spilled out. Inside, their gamble paid off. Several sealed crates of demolition charges sat untouched, along with spools of detonation wire and an assortment of tools. "Jackpot," Miguel muttered, pulling a crate into the open. Dean inspected one of the charges, his brow furrowing. "Do you know how to set these?" Miguel hesitated before nodding. "I've seen it done a few times. It's not rocket science." Gregory stayed near the truck, his gaze scanning the shadows nervously. "Just hurry up. This place feels wrong." Back at Gregory's store, the trio worked in grim silence. Dean inspected the charges while Miguel loaded more ammonium nitrate shells. Gregory sat nearby, his shotgun resting across his lap as he eyed the little red flyer. Its once bright red paint faded to a dull rust. "Can't believe we're dragging that thing into a fight," Gregory said. Dean didn't look up from his work. "It's carried a lot of weight before. It'll hold." Miguel glanced at the wagon, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Makes you think, huh? What you used to do with your time and what you're doing now." Dean finished, connecting the detonation wire to a charge. What I used to do doesn't matter. This is what we've got now. With the wagon loaded and their weapons ready, the three stood in the dim light of the store's backlot. Gregory hefted his shotgun, now loaded with ammonium nitrate shells, and gave Dean a hard look. "This isn't just about us anymore," Gregory said. "You understand that, right?" Dean nodded, his expression resolute. "We're going to make it count." Miguel tightened the straps on his pack, glancing between the two. "Then let's finish this." They stepped into the night, the wagon creaking behind them as they made their way toward the canals and the nest that awaited them. Chapter 6. Into the depths the tunnel loomed ahead, its gaping mouth lit by the flickering flames of their discarded Molotov. Smoke and the acrid stench of burning slime hung in the air, stinging their eyes and noses. Dean tightened his grip on the shotgun, its weight steadying him as he took a deep breath. Behind him, Miguel tugged the little red flyer, its wheels squeaking faintly under the weight of the cardboard box filled with Molotov cocktails. Gregory walked beside him, the shotgun resting on his shoulder, its barrel glinting in the dim light. "This is it," Dean said, his voice low but firm. "No turning back." Gregory nodded, his jaw set. "Just say the word." Miguel glanced toward the tunnel. "We'll want to move fast. If we stick around too long, those eggs will start hatching." The tunnel walls glistened with a sickly yellow-green slime that pulsed faintly, almost as if alive. Miguel lit a torch, the flame casting grotesque shadows that danced along the walls. The air was thick, humid, and heavy with decay. Dean led the way, the shotgun raised and ready. The wagon's wheels creaked against the uneven ground, and every sound echoed unnervingly through the confined space. They didn't have to wait long for trouble. A faint slithering noise came from ahead, followed by the unmistakable hiss of the creatures. Dean stopped, raising a hand to signal silence. Miguel extinguished the torch, plunging them into near darkness save for Gregory's flashlight beam. The first creature darted out of the shadows, its eye stalks swiveling toward them. Dean fired, the ammonium nitrate shell igniting in a fiery burst that illuminated the tunnel. The creature screeched, its body writhing as flames consumed it. More followed, their tentacles lashing out. Miguel grabbed a Molotov from the wagon, lighting it and throwing it into the mass of slithering shapes. The explosion filled the tunnel with light and heat, but the creatures kept coming. "Pull back to the chamber," Dean shouted, firing another shot. The group reached the heart of the tunnel, a massive chamber slick with slime. Translucent egg sacs pulsated along the walls, their gelatinous surfaces quivering as the shapes inside writhed. At the center stood the queen, a massive creature that dwarfed the others. Its eye stalks swiveled toward them, human-like irises locking onto their every movement. Miguel froze. That's their queen." Dean's voice was steady despite the terror in his eyes. "We take it out. We take them all out." Gregory stepped forward, raising his shotgun. "Light her up." Dean and Miguel grabbed Molotovs from the wagon, lighting them and hurling them at the queen. Flames erupted across the chamber, catching the queen and several smaller creatures in the blast. The queen let out an ear-splitting screech, its tentacles flailing wildly as it writhed in agony. As the queen thrashed, the swarm retaliated. Smaller slugs surged forward, their tentacles lashing out with corrosive precision. Gregory fired into the mass, his shotgun tearing through their slimy bodies. "Get the charges set," he yelled, his voice echoing through the chaos. Dean dropped to his knees, pulling the charges from his pack. He worked quickly, his hands shaking as he connected the detonation wires. Miguel grabbed another Molotov, lighting it with trembling hands. "Hurry!" One of the creatures lashed out, its tentacle wrapping around Gregory's leg. He let out a sharp cry, the corrosive slime eating through his pants and into his flesh. "Dad!" Dean shouted, but Gregory raised his shotgun, blasting the creature away. Another tentacle struck Gregory in the chest, knocking him backward. He hit the ground hard, blood trickling from his mouth. Dean scrambled toward him, but Gregory held up a hand. "No," he gasped. "You have to finish this." "Dad, No." Gregory's voice was sharp despite the pain. "You don't get to quit now. You hear me? Finish it." Miguel pulled Dean back. "We're out of time." Dean hesitated, his jaw tight as tears brimmed in his eyes. Then he nodded, his voice breaking. "I'll make it count." Dean set the final charge, the timer ticking down as he and Miguel sprinted toward the exit. Gregory fired his shotgun one last time, buying them precious seconds as the creatures swarmed over him. The tunnel shook violently as the charges detonated. A deafening roar tore through the air, and a fiery shockwave engulfed the chamber. Dean and Miguel burst into the open just as the tunnel collapsed behind them, sending a plume of smoke and ash into the sky. The two collapsed onto the muddy bank, their chests heaving. Miguel stared at the smoldering ruins, his face pale. Dean sat up, his face streaked with soot and tears. His gaze fell on the overturned wagon, the cardboard box now empty. He clenched his fists, his voice low. "He saved us." Miguel nodded, his voice quiet. "And everyone else." Dean stood, gripping the flashlight his father had passed to him. "If it's not over," he said, his voice firm, "we'll be ready." Epilogue. The stillness, the morning sun rose slowly over the canals, its light struggling to penetrate the haze of smoke and ash that hung in the air. The stench of burning slime lingered, mixing with the familiar, earthy scent of the water. Dean Parker sat on the bank, his shotgun resting across his knees. He hadn't moved much since the explosion, his gaze fixed on the smoldering ruins of the collapsed tunnel. His face was streaked with soot and dried tears, his eyes red-rimmed but resolute. Miguel approached quietly, carrying a thermos filled with coffee and 2 chip mugs he'd scrounged from Gregory's store. He poured the steaming liquid carefully, handing 1 cup to Dean without a word. Then he sat beside him, staring out over the canals. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "You think it's really over?" Miguel asked finally, his voice subdued. Dean exhaled slowly, the steam from the coffee mingling with his breath. "I don't know," he admitted. "We killed a lot of them, destroyed the nest, but there's no way to be sure." He glanced at Miguel. "What about you? Any sign of anything?" Miguel shook his head. "No trails, no movement. But—" He hesitated, his grip tightening on the thermos. "These things, they're not natural. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that nature always finds a way to adapt." Dean nodded grimly, staring down at his coffee. "So we stay ready." Loose ends in the days that followed. Life in Dry Hollow resumed its uneasy rhythm, but the town carried an unspoken unease. The story of the creatures never made it to the news. Dean had reported the explosion as an accident during routine canal maintenance, and Miguel backed him up. It was easier that way, less panic, fewer questions they couldn't answer. But the people of Dry Hollow weren't fools. They knew something strange had happened. Some whispered about the missing homeless, others about the strange burns and slime trails near the canals. A few brave or foolish souls ventured out to see the site of the explosion, only to find the area eerily quiet, the canal water stagnant and dark. Dean spent his days at his father's store, the emptiness inside almost unbearable. Gregory's old shotgun hung above the counter, a silent reminder of his sacrifice. Dean polished it often, even though it never seemed to need it. Miguel stayed in town, taking on more work with the canal system. He poured himself into repairs, trying to restore a sense of normalcy. But every time he passed certain stretches of the canals, the memories came flooding back. He and Dean met regularly, sharing information and keeping an eye out for anything unusual. One evening, Miguel found himself wandering to the canal's edge, staring at the spot where the tunnel had collapsed. The water was eerily still, its surface reflecting the dim light of the moon. In the silence, he thought he heard something, a faint ripple, a distant slap, but when he turned his flashlight toward the water, there was nothing there. Dean's vigil one night. Weeks after the explosion, Dean sat on the porch of the store, a cold beer in hand. The town was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of streetlights. For the first time in a long while, he felt a small sense of peace. The shotgun rested against the wall behind him, polished to a near shine. Dean sipped his beer slowly, his eyes drifting toward the horizon where the canals lay hidden in shadow. The quiet didn't last. A faint, wet slapping noise reached his ears, carried on the breeze. Dean froze, his breath catching in his throat. It was distant, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. He set the bottle down, grabbed the flashlight, and stood. The beam cut through the darkness, scanning the empty street. There was nothing there. Still, his gut told him otherwise. He turned toward the door, grabbing the shotgun on his way out. As he stepped off the porch, he glanced back at the store. Gregory's presence lingered there, in the quiet corners and the polished wood of the counter. "Don't worry, Dad," Dean murmured. "I'll keep it safe." Unfinished business, Dean followed the sound, his boots crunching softly on the gravel road. The slapping noise faded, replaced by the whisper of the wind through the trees. When he reached the edge of town, he stopped, staring out at the dark expanse of fields and canals stretching endlessly into the distance. The air was heavy, the kind of stillness that held its breath before a storm. He stood there for a long time, the shotgun resting against his shoulder, the flashlight in his hand, waiting for what he didn't know, but he would be ready.